evening. Welcome to Global Dialogue, a program dedicated to an exploration of global issues with a local flavor to it. We may think that what happens in the rest of the world doesn't affect us, but it's not the case. We live in a smaller and smaller global village. My guest this evening is Mark Juergensmeyer. Professor Juergensmeyer teaches at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And from my perspective, he's a superb teacher in that he has this interesting belief that in order to know something, you have to go there and find it out. Welcome to Global Dialogue, Mark. And most recently, by way of habit, when I write to you, I usually begin with where on this small planet are you? And last time I think you were in the Middle East, which is of huge consequence for the world. And we're likely to find that we are impacted by what goes on there as we go on.
Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Kurdistan and Iraq and southeastern Turkey, and was there at the time that there was an incursion against the Kurds, and I was with the Kurds at the time. It was interesting experience.
Well, help us understand what on earth is happening there. Why, as that famous bard said, can't we just get along?
We can't just get along in Santa Barbara, much less the United States, much less the rest of the world. People are people. In an era of globalization, a lot of the old secure frameworks, and especially the kind of framework of national identity that was set in place at the end of World War II, and that we thought would last forever. People our generation thought we were in the international era, and the United Nations would be this forum that would bring together peoples from all over the world, and they would be able to adjudicate their differences in this kind of parliament of nations.
Yeah, what happened to that dream?
Well, it still exists, and the United Nations is still a very important institution. I'm not doubting that for a second. But the whole notion of the Enlightenment notion of the secular nation state is under challenge in a world where a changing character of social identities, particularly in an era of globalization that has weakened the whole framework of the nation state, has also weakened the ideological notion of nationalism. The idea that particular countries are defined by secular borders that often, in many cases, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Asia and Africa, were defined by colonial governments and literally just lines drawn across the sand. And then suddenly now they're expected to defend and identify with a kind of fictitious entity. All nations are fictitious entities, but in many parts of the Middle East and Asia and Africa, they're really fictitious, because they don't line up with any of the kind of natural associations, particularly ethnically and religious. And so it's not really a surprise that these ethnic and religious identities would come to the fore at a time when the idea of the nation state begins to fray.
And has this happened because of globalization? Is there?
Yeah, I think it's part of the winds of change of which globalization is a part. The whole, in a global era where everyone can live everywhere and everything is made everywhere and is, where it's not clear who's in charge, who's the authority, who is running the show, where so much of the important things in life are transnational or outside of the borders of the nation state.
Well, this brings
you can see how the old national identities and the old nation state formula doesn't quite work.
Well, yeah, that was obvious when it started happening, but it gave rise to yet another dream. Perhaps it was the one that was going to supplant the United Nations, but the dream was that as we would move into this era of globalization, we would come to be closer and closer, and that didn't happen.
It has happened. It's happened in two different ways, on two different levels. It's happened in the way that you're talking about it, in a kind of transnational level, particularly among people of concern, of goodwill, who will reach out and try to help people in need wherever they are on the planet. And this I was with refugees, several weeks ago. When I said I was in Kurdistan and Iraq and southeastern Turkey, I went there to interview refugees, and refugees fleeing from ISIS. And these were Sunni and Shia people who lived in Iraq, Yazidis and Christians who lived in Iraq and Syria, and they were literally fleeing for their lives. And they're people who experienced the unraveling of the nation state of Syria and Iraq, which, by the way, are a couple of these kind of British civil service defined countries at the end of the Ottoman Empire that had no real connection with the way in which people were configured ethnically on the ground. So now there's this whole new entity of the Islamic State that has emerged, and people who feel alienated and marginalized. So two things are happening. And one is that they are being embraced by people around the world. I mean, the refugee camps that I saw I was impressed with the quality of them. That the United Nations and relief agencies and people of church organizations, people of goodwill have reached out to try to help support these people. You can see the Syrians fleeing into Europe. Yeah, there's some nasty people in Hungary and other places at the border saying, we don't want refugees, stay out. But then there are people at the train stations in Germany and in Austria saying, we're here to help. How can we help you? Welcome. We want to take care of you. The Pope has opened up his apartment in the Vatican for Syrian refugees to stay. So the world is, on the one hand, the world is attentive to the crises that is created by this kind of this transformation of the nation state and the global world. At the same time, local communities are hunkering down. They are reaching out for their own kind. There is a kind of new tribalism. The same tribalism that produced the Islamic State in a negative sense also produces a warm welcome home for Kurds who have been kicked out of Syria and kicked out of the ISIS-controlled areas of Iraq. They're welcome in Kurdistan. They're welcome in this new entity. You're saying, where's Kurdistan? I can't find it on a map. Well, it doesn't exist on a map. It is the northern part of Iraq, when the Kurdish people of this region of the world, in Turkey and Iran and Iraq, have never had their own nation. But now they do. There is an identity. There is a community there of support. In southeastern Turkey, it's still part of Turkey, but it's such a Kurdish region that there is a sense of Kurdish identity to provide a nurturing and supporting place for refugees. So,
but that's not an acceptable item for Turkey.
It's not an acceptable item for Turkey, but that's the problem. The nation states are not able to control nation states anymore. The whole national identity, the kind of border that was set up at the end of World War II, and that, okay, this is the way the world is going to work, it really never has worked very well. And it's really not working very well now. When, as I say, everybody can live everywhere and you can identify with every place, and it's hard to control what goes on in your own, what you thought as your own region of the world. We find that in the United States. I mean, this is what fuels kind of right-wing politics in the United States, the feeling that all these foreigners are coming in and taking over the country. Foreigners have come in and taken over the country from the beginning. This is from 1492. This is what's been going on in the Americas and North America as a continent. It's continuing to go on. But it's understandable that everybody fears change. And once even though change produced, your family were refugees, my family were refugees, most of us in the United States, we call us immigrants, but we were fleeing from something. That's how we came here. Mm-hmm. But once we got here, we said, okay, now we're here, let's take over. So when a new waves of refugees come in, we say, oh no, we don't want the new refugees, us old refugees, we're the ones that want to be in control.
Isn't this the same thing we often refer to as NIMBY, not in my backyard?
Right. But it's not realizing that we're the ones who staked up, we set up our camp in the backyards of somebody else.
Right.
That's how we got our backyard.
Right. Tell me a little about ISIS. How did Where did that come from? What was the source of inspiration for the creation of this essentially non-nation state? And it has a new character, a different character, a caliphate.
Yeah. Well, it has a very specific origin, and it has a very specific origin organizationally, and that is who the people were. Al-Baghdadi came out of a group that was created after the U.S. invasion of an occupation of Iraq. When the U.S. came in 2003, and we thought, okay, we get rid of Saddam Hussein, and we'll have a secular country. Well, it didn't work that way because all of these ethnic politics began to unravel. And I was there in 2004 and talking with some of the leaders of the Sunni areas of Western Iraq. And they were resisting the American occupation. Why? Because they thought this was going to lead to a new form of domination of the Sunnis by the Shia. And that's exactly what happened. And it happened particularly after the Americans left. While the Americans were still there under Petraeus, we'd worked out a deal whereby some of the Sunni tribals would be empowered. But this was the context in which Al-Qaeda in Iraq arose. Remember the guy Zakari?
Yeah.
And you remember he was, people in orange jumpsuits, and he was cutting off their necks. Well, you recognize them, the style of operation. Well, al-Baghdadi was a part of that outfit. And then when the awakening movement came and Petraeus and the Americans were able to support Sunni tribals to turn against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, it died away. But when the Americans left, a deal that was worked out under George W. Bush, but we don't have to get into the politics of it, but when the U.S. troops left Iraq, and then al-Maliki was solely in charge, the Shia leader who pandered to the interests of his Shia base, the Sunnis felt like they were marginalized and left out of power again. So it created a situation, a vacuum of power in Western Iraq where the Sunnis felt like they were marginalized and disenfranchised from power.
Could we or did we examine the possibility that something like this would happen?
Sure.
I mean, it seems to me that when the first Gulf War ended with a statement by President Bush at the time, the first President Bush, that we weren't going to go on to Baghdad. We were going to let well enough alone.
Because that would involve nation building.
It would have involved nation building, and it seems to me that part of the rationale was we were fearful that should we do that, there'd be all hell to pay.
Right.
So we must have had that idea. Why didn't we apply it?
Why didn't his son have the same wisdom that his father had? I don't know. I mean, that was, of course, the tragedy of the unraveling of Iraq, that the U.S. didn't have the vision that would take an enormous resources to try to rebuild Iraq once Humpty Dumpty came down,
Sure.
once Saddam Hussein came down. And Barbara Bodine, who was here at UCSB at the time, was brought back to be in charge of Baghdad and the reconstruction, and she had a vision of utilizing the old Iraq army, utilizing the Ba'ath Party administrators in the new Iraq, and she was kicked out within a week because of a different vision. Oh no, we don't want any of those people in charge. And so the Sunnis who were part of the Iraq army and the Ba'ath Party just felt that they were totally marginalized, and it set the stage for internal Shia-Sunni conflict within the region. So it was our doing to some extent. It was not just the toppling of Saddam, but the way in which the U.S. occupation was done.
Would it be fair to say?
But it had to come to an end sooner or later, and the ending was negotiated by George W. Bush. So by the
Sure.
time Obama came in, there was nothing. The die had already been cast.
Returning to the issue of ISIS and its creation, would it be fair to say that the United States had a significant role to play in the creation of ISIS?
a significant but not a direct role. It's not as if the U.S. wanted.
Certainly not intentional. No, no, no.
But certainly the way in not just the toppling of Saddam, but the way in which the occupation was handled or mishandled created the circumstances of Sunni rejection that allowed the fertile ground for ISIS to grow. And right across the border, same thing was happening in Syria. And in Syria, the Sunnis in Syria are the majority. And they felt that they were marginalized by a government that was a government by and for a minority religious community of, they're kind of like Shiites, the Alawites. That I've been to some Alawite mosque, and they really are like Shia, but they're not quite Shia. It's a complicated story. But in any event, they're not Sunnis. And so Bashar Assad, the leader of Syria, is seen as a representative of a different community. He protects Alawites, he protects Christians. There's a sizable Christian community in Syria who deserve to be protected. It should be. But the majority of the people are Sunnis, and they feel like they've been left out of power. So here you have the fertile grounds on both sides of the border, Syria and Iraq, for somebody to come in riding on a white horse and carrying a sword and saying, hey, we're going to create a whole new Islamic state, a new caliphate, and you guys, my brothers, my Sunni brothers, you are going to be in charge. We're going to put you back to work. Your old Ba'ath Party administrative leadership, we're going to put you back in give you jobs, put you back in charge. We're going to bring the Iraqi army people out of the mothballs, and we're going to give you a whole new army to be in charge. Well, that's exciting stuff. And why wouldn't they want to follow that wonderful, stirring
Mark,
challenge of a new Islamic state?
You almost had me convinced.
Yes.
So here we are. We have an ongoing group called ISIS.
Right.
We have an ongoing conflict that seems to know no end. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence of that conflict, we have huge numbers of people fleeing their homes in search for a safe haven, and going to be making their mark felt in various other parts of the Middle East. I can only imagine what it's doing to the economy of Jordan, and
not just Jordan and Lebanon.
Yeah.
And 2 million no more than that now in Turkey. In Kurdistan Kurdistan is a country of 6 million. I mean, a region of 6 million. They regard themselves as a separate country in northern Iraq. 2 million of which are refugees.
Yeah.
The numbers are staggering.
What do we do?
Well, none of these refugees want to stay there forever. I mean, everybody that I talk with this summer, and I talk with scores of refugees in camps near Erbil in Kurdistan and in southeastern Turkey, they all wanted to go home. I mean, these are not opportunists in the sense of, they're deliberately wanting to, to live off of the welfare state in Germany or Europe or the United States. No, they all want to go home. Is that possible? Well, it seems to me there are solutions. There is a way in which if Damascus, in the capital of Syria, and Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, changed their policies in such a way that would be welcoming to Sunni leadership, and Sunnis were involved, and the Sunni tribal leaders were empowered to actually rise up against ISIS, they'd do it. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons Baghdadi knows this. He knows that these are very fickle loyalties from the Sunnis. Mm-hmm. He knows they turned against him once before, and he knows he has to intimidate in some ways, and that's where the crazies come in. All these crazy young people that are kind of excited about, joining the great caliphate, and they've been seeing these computer images. It's almost like computer games, and the whole business of lopping off people's heads. Oh, that's radical stuff, man! I'm going to join the big revolution. I'm going to become a hero. It's tragic. Most of these kids they're cannon fodder. They strap suicide belts on them and they lead them in. They're blown up. It's a tragic waste of life and a tragic ending for young people in Europe and North Africa and the United States who see these images and join ISIS. But al-Baghdadi needs them because he has a regime run on terror. It's a regime of intimidation because he's so afraid that what I say will actually happen. That is, that the Sunnis will turn against him once they have an opportunity of actually being a part of the governments of Syria and Iraq. And I think that's absolutely true. That's what will happen. And that will make a difference. And the whole ISIS thing could collapse like a house of cards. Not easily, because he's going to fight now. He's going to turn these crazies loose and try to, use the intimidation of beheading and all these fierce methods in order to scare the crap out of people, which is why life is so intolerable for the people that I talk with, these refugees. It's not just that they're living under circumstances that are difficult economically and an occupied regime, but it's a very rigid, rigorous, and brutal Islamic regime, and it's terrifying.
So the Juergensmeyer take on this, in terms of a solution,
Right.
is for the governments, the authorities in Syria and Iraq,
Right.
to change.
Right.
Is there the will to change?
Could be, but I think it would take pressure from outside. And I think that's where the key governments, the key players really are Iran and Russia. Because Iran has influence over both Baghdad and Damascus. And Russia has influence over Damascus. And I think one of the most important elements of this negotiation the United States has had with Iran in recent months, with a kind of the agreement over nuclear weapons, and try to work out an accommodation with Iran. I think one of the most important aspects of that deal is not the nuclear weapons, but it's a working relationship with Iran over ISIS. Because American bombs are not going to ultimately make that much difference. I mean, they're going to help contain the situation. And the raid that just this last week along the border of Kurdistan and Iraq, that released 70 Kurdish prisoners. Unfortunately, one American was killed in that, but it was an extraordinary achievement of releasing all of those prisoners. That can happen, but it's not going to essentially change things. What's essentially going to change things is taking the props out of ISIS by getting the Sunni leadership to reject ISIS and turn towards a new government in Baghdad and Damascus. And Iran could make that happen.
In a sense, you're defining a chess game. And if I were a chess player here, I would be thinking, okay, let's do this. But what are the next steps? Will the solution, the elimination of ISIS, the intervention of Iran, the cooperation of other adversaries, will American interests be negatively affected in the long run by this kind of intervention?
I think increasingly American interests have to be done collaboratively with other governments. And I think that's so clear to me in the case of ISIS and Syria and Iran, that the best solution would be a kind of multinational effort that would include the United States and Russia and Iran, maybe other European players, Turkey certainly, Saudi Arabia, who could then work with the governments of Iraq and Syria and really force them to change, because they have to be forced to change. No, they don't want to change because they build up their base on their, this Shia platform of support in both Baghdad and Damascus. So no, they don't want to change, but they have to. And if there is going to be any unraveling of the ISIS
and what's going
network.
to cause that change?
Otherwise, you're going to get ISIS forever. You will, in fact, get a whole new state. It will be there. You will have on the map now a whole new state called the Islamic State, that consists of eastern Syria and western Iraq.
What
Those are
would,
the only two options. I
what
guess.
would cause, taking option one, what would cause the players to cooperate?
The realization that if you let ISIS continue, it's going to be a huge threat to them.
So it's
To
their
the region.
interest.
It's to their interest. That Iran will have to realize that this is going to destabilize the whole region, that they're going to essentially, they want to have, Shia influence from Syria to Iraq, but if ISIS is created as a whole new Sunni, virulent, angry, anti-Iranian, anti-Shia entity, that's going to be threatening to Iran for years to come. Russia, they're going to have to realize that these are the same people could then influence Chechnya. You're going to be a part of the Islamic extremists that are going to continue to terrorize Russia. So both Russia and Iran are going to have to realize it's in their interest, and it's their interest to work with the U.S. And the U.S. is going to have to realize it's in its interest to work with Russia and Iran in a common solution over what is, in fact, a problem that affects all of them.
Okay, you'll have to come back after some months and see whether any of this happens. Where are you off to next?
Well, I just came back from Sweden. I was working with the University of Uppsala. I've just joined on to a 5-year project on how do jihadi movements come to an end, and where my job will be to try to figure out just what we've been talking about. And guess what? I've been given ISIS. So I'm going to look at ISIS, and I'm going to compare it with a couple of other movements where kind of terrorism is coming to. One is the Moros in the Philippines, and the other is the Sikhs, the Punjabi uprising in the 80s that came to an end in the Punjab.
Wow.
And see if there are lessons that can be learned from these forms of extremist activity that might help us understand what's happening in ISIS and other parts of the world.
Well, Mark Juergensmeyer, thank you for being with us, helping us understand a very complex situation in the Middle East. For Global Dialogue, good night.